There's a fascinating paradox at the heart of any constitution. On one hand, it's supposed to be the supreme law of the land, the solid foundational rock. But on the other, it has to be a living document, right? It's got to be able to adapt as times change. And that creates this incredible vulnerability. So how do you protect a system that's literally designed to be changed? Well, let's dive into the defense systems built right into the constitutions themselves.
It is a pretty chilling question, isn't it? Can the very process that's meant to improve and update a constitution actually become a self-destruct button? I mean, if you follow all the rules, dot all the I's and cross all the T's, could you pass an amendment that just dismantles the whole system? This isn't just some late-night philosophical puzzle. History gives us a terrifyingly real answer.
And this is it. This is exactly what happened in Germany in 1933. The Weimar Constitution was legally amended using something called the Enabling Act. And that act basically gave the government absolute power. Democracy, using its own rules, literally voted itself out of existence. It was a trauma that forced modern constitutional designers to ask a really critical question. How do we build a better defense system?
So they came up with two main lines of defense. You can think of them as two different types of constitutional armor. First, you've got procedural limitations. These are all about the how. They don't necessarily forbid any particular change, they just make the process of changing things incredibly difficult. And then you have substantive limitations. These focus on the what. They draw a hard red line in the sand and say certain fundamental principles are just off-limits, unamendable, period.
Okay, so let's start with that first line of defense, the procedural gauntlet. The idea here is pretty simple, actually. If you make amending the Constitution a long, difficult, consensus-driven marathon, you prevent any single group from just ramming through some radical change on a whim.
The United States Constitution is a classic example of this in action. Article 5 lays out this grueling, multi-stage process. First, an amendment has to be proposed with a supermajority. That's a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. Then, it gets sent out to all 50 states for the final, and frankly, the most difficult hurdle, ratification.
And that final step, ratification, requires a massive, massive consensus. Not just a simple majority, but 3/4 of the states. That's 38 out of 50 states that have to agree. This ridiculously high bar is exactly why, out of more than 11,000 proposed amendments in U.S. history, only 27 have ever made it through. The system is just built for stability.
And here's a really unique feature of the American system. Get this. The president has zero role. Zilch. Nada. They can't propose an amendment. They can't sign it. They can't veto it. This was actually confirmed way back in 1798. The thinking was that changing the fundamental law of the land is a power that comes directly from the people, not from the executive branch.
But let's pause for a second. What if a movement is so powerful, so incredibly popular, that it can actually clear even the toughest procedural hurdles? What happens then? Well, this is where that second line of defense comes into play. The idea that some things, some core principles, are so fundamental, they should never be amendable at all.
After the absolute catastrophe of the Weimar Republic, Germany built its new constitution, called the Basic Law, on this very idea. And it starts with this powerful absolute statement in Article 1. This isn't just some nice-sounding goal, it's the foundational pillar of their entire legal system. And they decided they had to protect it and other core principles permanently. And they did this with something called an eternity clause. The German term is Ewigkeitsklausel. It's a specific provision, in Germany's case Article 79.3, that acts like a permanent safety wall around the Constitution's most essential features. It places them forever beyond the reach of any majority in Parliament, no matter how big that majority gets. So what exactly is behind this safety wall? Well, it's the core identity of the German state. Things like its federal structure can't be abolished, the principles of being a democratic and social state are protected, and of course, the big one, the inviolability of human dignity, the rule of law, and the separation of powers. These are the things Germany looked at and said, nope, non-negotiable. Now, this is a huge contrast to what you see in the United States. The U.S. Constitution does have one, and only one, explicitly unamendable provision, but it's not about human dignity or democracy. It's about making sure no state can be deprived of its equal vote in the Senate without its own consent. So you could say, while Germany built a fortress around its core values, the U.S. built a single, very specific lockbox for an issue of federal balance.
This all raises a really crucial question. We know procedural hurdles can be overcome, and we know Germany has this explicit eternity clause. But what if a constitution has neither of those things? What happens when there are no written red lines? Well, that brings us to the absolutely incredible story of India's judiciary.
So India's constitution, when it was drafted, had a really tough amendment process, but no eternity clause. It looked like Parliament, if it had a big enough majority, could pretty much change anything it wanted. And this set the stage for a decades-long constitutional showdown between a powerful Parliament and a very determined Supreme Court.
And the result of this epic battle was something called the Basic Structure Doctrine. Now, this is fascinating because it's not written down anywhere in the text of the Constitution. It's a principle created by the Supreme Court. The court essentially said, look, Parliament, you have the power to amend, but you do not have the power to destroy. You can renovate the building, but you cannot demolish its foundations.
And man, what a battle it was. Just look at this timeline. In 1951, the court says Parliament's power is unlimited. Then, in 1967, it does a complete 180, saying fundamental rights can't be touched. Parliament pushes back hard. Finally, in this landmark 1973 case of Ananda Bharti, the court finds the middle ground. The Basic Structure Doctrine is born. The whole thing culminates in 1980 with Minerva Mills, where the court made this incredible declaration that the limited nature of amending power is itself part of the basic structure.
This powerful quote from that Minerva Mills case really just sums up the whole argument. The court's logic was that Parliament's power to amend is a gift from the Constitution. It's a created power. A body that's given a limited power can't use that very same power to grant itself an unlimited one. That would be like destroying the very source of your own authority. And over the years since, the court has identified several pillars as being part of this unwritten, unamendable core. Things you'd expect, like the supremacy of the Constitution itself, the rule of law, the power of judicial review, but also secularism, federalism, and the independence of the judiciary. In essence, the court created an implied eternity clause, where none was ever written down.
So we've seen procedural walls, we've seen explicit substantive walls, and we've even seen judicially built walls. But there's one final layer, one last line of defense that is maybe the most profound of them all.
And for that, we have to go back to Germany one last time. In Article 20, Clause 4 of its Basic Law, it gives the people themselves an explicit constitutional right to resist. It says that if anyone tries to abolish the constitutional order and all other options have failed, all Germans have the right to resist. Think of this as the final emergency brake. It's an absolute right that only kicks in at the moment of an existential threat, when the courts, the police, and the entire political process have been subverted or have totally failed. It is the Constitution's final admission that, in the end, its survival depends on the will of the people to stand up and defend it.
Which brings us right back to our final question. We've seen constitutions defended by complex procedures, by unchangeable written rules, by the powerful interpretations of judges, and finally, by a right to resist given to the people themselves. It really suggests that a constitution isn't just a piece of paper, it's a whole system of defenses. And maybe the ultimate guardian isn't any single one of those things, but the constant dynamic interplay between the text, the courts, and the people who live under its protection.